Islam, Islam, Islam. Can you hear me clearly now? I trust that you can hear me clearly now. I need to know. All right. I have two boards open, and I muted one and did not the other, so it got a little hairy. Islam, 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 everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I'll do the introduction over again. Welcome to the Moorish Heritage and History School, MHHI Flight Open blog broadcast. This one is where we read a book. Now, we're going to have to name this. I guess it'll be that we're reading. Sister Anna Eid started doing it. Well, first of all, Anna Eid is doing well, much better, and, we still send our love out to her. And she started this book reading of White Cargo. And I read chapter 10 and 11 last week, and this week we are going to do chapter 12 and possibly 13. But prior to us doing so, I would like to, there was a couple of words that we wanted to look up and see what they meant. And, of course, Brother Bakari, he certainly did. One of them was dragoon, and the other was drum clog, which we thought drum clog because it said the Moor drum clog. However, a moor is like marshlands or wetlands, so it's a place. Call in our last reading, where we got that from is that they had sent out dragoons, which, I trust that Bakari's going to, I would like for Bakari to press one and us them if they're listening so we could just cap up on these definitions and then I'll read it. So I don't see him, but if he presses one, I'll see him right away. I know he's going to be on, so I'll wait for Bakari to press one and for us. But in the meantime, until he can explain dragoons. However, the drum clog, which we thought was a being's name, a person's name, a Moor's name, it really was a Moor called drum clog, which is a place, because remember, Moors and marshlands, they are wetlands. They're like, they're like an area that gets wet. There's different types of, and bogs and stuff like that. Some bogs, as they did the study, get wet only because of the rain that comes down. And I forgot the name they called them. But at any rate, so it didn't mean a person. It meant a place, drum clog. And then I did some research, and I know Bakari did too, because he sent it to me. And drum clog, there was a battle with drum clog. Now remember, I would think that it is definitely associated here, it is associated here, whether it was the particular situation that we read last week, because last week it said how they sent the dragoons out to a conventicle and or they'll say covenanter, that's covenant, that means a group of people, and conventicle means a congregation of people. So that's the terminology they would call it. So they sent out the dragoons, which would be more on the so-called authority government, as they would say, which would be really the British, to a group of people who were, basically congregating. But when they got there, this book says that, they were not, nothing went down. In other words, the conventors or the conventicle of people, backed them down. Now, what is interesting and so good for study is we have to go back and look at the date on that in this book, White Cargo, because it might be just talking about it, glossing over it. However, there was, in fact, a battle of drum clogs, and they call it the Battle of. And at that battle, in fact, it said that the dragoons were, they did not win. They did not, in any way, they were not able to disperse. And remember, that group of people were armed, and they say in this book that's when it started, their right to kind of bear arms type thing. And I wish I had the page here with me, but I don't. And it said that in the book that, this started a different manner of, interactions because now the people were like, hey, we're going to bear arms. So when you go and you look up the Battle of Drumclock, it could very well be, in fact, talking about that same one because it's at that Battle of Drumclock that the historical mention here. Let me see. I'll just give you what it says generally, if I can. That in fact, this may in fact be that same altercation or situation. Here's this drum clock. And in the research of it, the Battle of Drum Clock happened, I believe this is on June 1st, 1679. So it definitely dives up, if you will, to this occurrence mentioned in the book. So there was about 200 of the people, or what they call covenants, or like a covenant agreement. You know what I mean? Like we have to, a covenant is an agreement. So it's like we have the Holy Covenant of the Moorish nations, and that would be covenant meaning only agreement, not some covenants, but that's what they started calling it, They started saying, oh, that's a covenant, that's a whatever, and it really comes from the word of a covenant, which means agreement. So what you're saying is a group of people or family of people or families of people who are in agreement. And so, of course, they call that congregating today and try to make statutes laws and congregating. So that is an interesting thing. Now, as far as the dragoons, again, is Brother Bakari on the line? Could you press 1? And if he's not, then we can talk about it later. But the dragoons was, in fact, what he thought it was. It's just a military regime. That's really what it is. And they do mocks of it in some places today that it has no force, but then there's other places that they, in fact, do. In fact, in, I believe it's Peru, they actually have their troop of dragoons. Brazilian president, they have a regiment of dragoons, the First Guards Cavalry Regiment of the Brazilian Army. And then you have, and the name was given, some of them changed their names, at different times, what they call them, but they still exist. So when you go to parades, you might see them. Canada has 3, the Royal Canadian Dragoons and the 2 Reserve Regiments, the British Columbia Dragoons, and the Saskatchewan Dragoons. The Royal Canadian is the senior armored regiment of the Canadian Forces. And then the Royal Canadian Mounted Police were accorded the formal status of a regiment of dragoons in 1921. And you can go through and just find, interesting information regarding the police of Chile. They were 1758. They were founded as Dragoons de la Reina, which means Queen's Dragoons, and that was in 1758. But later, they were renamed as the Dragoons of Chile in 1812, and then became the Carabineros. Carabineros are the National Police of Chile. Interesting how, you look at how the morphing of this thing is. So, Denmark has the Danish army. They're called the Judish Dragoon, etc. So some of them, again, just carry tradition, but they don't necessarily carry force or quote-unquote military force. So here's what we're going to do. I think I covered that, but I do want to say thank you to Brother Bakari for looking up that information. We appreciate it, and we shared it with you. So now we are going to, I guess we need to go ahead and start on the right. All right. All right. This chapter 12 is called Barbados. Play on words, because remember the last chapter we found out that there was a whole lot of Irishmen, right, who were actually brought in as slaves in Barbados. Oh man, how many people knew that? Well, of course we didn't necessarily know because we didn't know that any modern Europeans were slaves at all in the American land. So what do we? And that's also America as well. So I'll just read the last paragraph of the last two paragraphs of the last chapter. In fact, really starts hitting on where they really went in or going to go into slavery, and they didn't care what quote unquote skin tone or color that they would say you were. This is all about the industry of slavery. It's just interesting to know that it didn't start with Moors being those slaves. It really did not. It was more, as you saw in this last paragraph, it unveiled a lot. It was more modern Europeans that were slaves, period. Like I think they talked about 20 that they called from Africa out of 3,000. So, you do the math on that. And then later it just became an industry, and they found that Moors were just stronger, better, and whatever, and and even better at tilling in the land and dealing with the land because we've always done it. So then it became that they were a better commodity than their own. So I'll hit here. They also mentioned, and it was mentioned about Anthony Johnson, big thing down in Virginia plantation, being in prison. But guess what? He was a brother, and he himself was a slave, and then became free and had slaves. How about that? Now, let me just shift it here. Sure. Oh, yeah. That must be Brother Ascend. Let me make sure this comment about our definition. Brother Ascend is 61. Excellent. Yes, and you have a different number on it. How are you today?
All is well. All is well. So.
All right. Go ahead. I was just tapping up, and I trust you were listening from the beginning here.
Yes. Not from the beginning,
well, enough that I was just capping up on the dragoons. Remember, we wanted to know what the dragoons were and what drum clock was, so I just shared that because Brother Bakari tends to research on it.
Right, and he was in the military. Bakari was in the military. He was in the army too, so he understood it to be either part of the I think what he was saying, the cavalry, or the other unit that they have in the military. Yes.
Yes, military regiments, absolutely. And then I showed, and people can just look it up for themselves, how that morphed into even today, that they just, Chile and Finland and Denmark, they all have it. Some of them have no military force, but just a mockery of it, like you'll see in parades, but some of them have morphed into the current military force and or police in some places. Yep. So it's interesting, right? And then we also cleared up the drum. Yeah. Yeah. We also cleared up that question about drum clods, that that's a place. It's a moor, meaning a wetland, and not a person. Those are the two things.
Okay,
yeah. It's a wetland and a marsh, like a marshland. And I tell people all the time, when you look at the fact that, yes, we are more national, the first navigators, that's the transitive of what Moor means. And then when you find that the waters are named after, you could say, I am Moorine. If you look that up as a verb, it means that you are doing something on the waters of boats. That tells us because we are the first navigators, starting from the waters in our mother's womb, and then become the navigators on the earth plane, and then we start mooring the earth plane. You know what I'm saying? So when you go back and you see that, in language, it affirms all that is really, the truth about things, even though they also try to change the language and morph those into things where you can't make the connection. So.
Right, I'm following you 100%, and I'm seeing that in a lot of movies. When you watching these movies of during that time, they talk about the moorlands. The moorlands.
Yes.
I was watching a movie with the Turkish Muslims when they was fighting the Crusaders, and they was talking about the moorlands, these troops coming out of the moorlands or going back to the moorlands, and that was quite interesting how a lot of these labels carry over, and a lot of the names of places that was around the world is carried over on this continent, and you find these names here on our continent here
absolutely.
And I was thinking that when we was talking about the regiments, as they conquered and these crusades went on, and they pillaged and stuff, and when they left or before they left, how they build up these certain regiments and stuff, and they named them and gave them English names and things like that, and so how we see that stuff carried over, and the islands and all the places you was just naming. So yeah, that's very, very interesting. Matter of fact, I was in the military myself, and I was stationed down in Virginia, and I was in Portsmouth and all that, and I'm seeing all these names of those places down in Norfolk, Virginia, and everything. I'm seeing all Hampton Roads, all there, Northampton. I'm seeing all those names right here in this here book, and it's just bringing back memories. How they came here, cleared the land, and start naming places.
Well, that's what this book showed too in the earlier chapters, that they just came in and started naming stuff that was already the Aboriginal people.
That's right. Start naming them, and then start putting their citizens or their people in those places and rehabilitate them. And that's what they did.
And that's what they had to have done, and that's why it's so important that we get that you don't live in the state of whatever. No. It's very, very important because you're not a citizen of that or a member of that.
That's right.
Therefore, you that's why we use care of. Like, all right, I take male care of. It doesn't have to be where necessarily I am, but that's where I take male care of. That's why that's so important,
Yeah, and another point I wanted to make too, that we see from reading this here to all the listeners, we see from reading this here from the very beginning what they did, how they did it, how they called these things adventures, they set up these corporations, period. All right? They didn't say nothing about government, no nothing. They set up these corporations.
That's right.
As we read on, we see how the corporations became financially burdened because of the nature of the business that they were doing. We see how they set up buying stocks. We see how they set up the penal system. We see how now, what you was just talking about with the military force that they set up to come here, because if this don't work, once we did that, we was cool, so now we want to expand, and so what we're going to do is we're going to expand with force, and even if it didn't work at first, because we got to understand, they don't stop. They don't stop. That's why when you become conscious and you free yourself, you got to stay free.
Yeah.
You know, it's another phase to this thing, and staying free. Keep, like you continually talk about, not involving yourself in the commerce and not to do this here. Once you proclaim and you free and you cool already, you don't have to do these other things. Now stay free. Keep yourself, stay in your lane, you know, because we see what they started doing. And we seeing this here whole evolution. We seeing how this whole thing is evolving here. If you really, if everyone is listening to what you're doing, you and Mother Annie is doing by bringing this here each week, or, you know, when you're bringing it to the people, and the people is really paying attention, you see how this whole thing is evolving, how it evolved then, and what they set up then is still here now.
Yeah. Yes.
Don't get it confused with the government aspect of it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
You know, and pay particular attention to these time periods. Keep everything in chronological order so that you can follow on this here. And as we reference back and forth, it's very important, because we always say it wasn't no United States of America then. So when people caught up on this, it was nothing but corporations then. So don't get caught up on that. So I just wanted to say that, you know, as you know, as people is listening, you know, some people might have missed some classes. That's what went on, and you're seeing how this thing evolved. You're seeing who the players are in this thing. And another interesting thing I want to say, when we went back to the charter, and in the charter where it read for Sir Walter Raleigh and his heirs and or assigns, that charter start reading like a trust. It has like some legal elements in that, you know, language. You know, when you start studying different, you know, when you start studying law, you understand these words. It's a reason why they put those words on, and his heirs and or assigns. Yeah. And we see that in these companies. You know, that they get assigned these different positions, and they, you know, and they assign people to these different, to do certain duties and everything, and who assigned them. So it's very interesting. I was paying attention to that, you know, as this continues to unfold.
Yeah, and contract language and contracts as well, and they assign, even when you're dealing with those mortgages, which literally means that they're assigning that. That's the whole box on it. But see, if you know who you are as the heir, it can be bought or transferred, so they don't even have authority to assign jack. You know, but that's how they, in other words, they're using the assignment because they're not the actual heir or the aboriginal to the land estate. So they use those words, right? And it's still only the land. They use those words so that they can do what? Assign it to their descendants. See, this is what we got to understand.
That's what they do.
And that's what they do. But our position is greater than that. And so that's all called commerce stuff. That's why we have to really understand that our salvation and our birthright, this birthright, period, is not in the commercial processes. Not like that at all. And another thing that you brought up, which is great, we must remember that this is called white cargo, the forgotten history of Britain's white slaves in America. So even though we are the ones who, you know, the British ones, our cousins, you know, enslaved them in a very horrific kind of way, which the first chapter that Anna Eve read was from another book on the first series of this, and it described it as well. And it's described it as well. But, you know, even though we really started this slavery by having them in slavery, which is the reason why, as we bring this up, they're talking about the timeline. So Britain brought them here as well, and they asked for their independence from Britain, which they'll say England now, but England is the bastardized word. When they say English or Englishmen, you're talking about them, but it's English, British English, same thing. You got to know that in terms of the time frame and in terms of the police. And so they had to ask for their independence. Now, it's going to take us up to, all right, so that happened. And then because they were born into slavery for real, and this book right now is getting ready to get real, unfold this slavery thing, and that it is a commodity. It is an industry that they made, and now we get to the Constitution that ended it all.
Right.
Well,
and understand what happened also with this industry, too. All right? Because we have to understand our words, too. What they were getting was free labor.
Yeah.
That's very important to understand. They were getting free labor. And the reason I'm bringing that up, because I think you're getting ready to read it anyway in the last two paragraphs, where it says the
you know
shift
what?
from
This right here, this chapter, I'm going to go back on last, is beginning to really hit hard with how, they are really going hard in on slavery and how we, as an industry, how we were ended up brought into it because, on the last chapter, they talked about their discipline of whipping the slave. This shows you where that came in, And the truth is that, the modern European, they couldn't withstand all of that. We were stronger in our body. Not that that makes it right, because it doesn't. But they saw that, it's better to have them as slaves because they are more enduring of it. But you know what? I just realized that I believe Bakari is on the line, so we're going to bring him in real quick, and then I'll start reading just to make sure that he knows that. Brother Bakari, are you there?
Islam, yes I am.
Islam, all right. I'm glad to see you made it in press one, and I don't know if you were able to listen, but we did give thanks to you and acknowledging that. I thank you for doing that research on the two things that we were looking at last reading about dragoons, which is military force, and I think you heard us say how it's morphed into what it is today, and in some places, police, and also that drum clock was a place, and, that there was a battle with drum clock. Wow, that was really interesting, So,
yes.
I don't know if you wanted to add something to that.
How far did you guys get? I'm sorry, I wasn't able to hear. I was having some problems
I didn't.
with the.
I only mentioned that thanking you for looking up that, and I did go into, what the dragoons were, as you had said. Yeah, the dragoons, as you had said, it was the military, because we know you were in the military, so you already identified that. And I did mention that some of them now have morphed into and changed some names. They're still the dragoons. Some of them don't have military force. They just a mark of it, and you might see them in parades. And some of them do have military forces because dragoons are everywhere. Denmark, Finland, Peru, Chile. That is where they originated from. And in one place, they are now called the police of, I think it's Chile. So military from the door and still is, and therefore so are police.
Yes.
Oh, and I wanted to say to that, too. I know you talked, excuse me, Bakari. It was interesting that you mentioned something when you first heard it, if you remember. You was referring it to, the mafia.
I did. I said goons.
Yeah,
they always call.
Now, it's not that you was wrong.
Okay.
It's not that you were wrong, all right? Because you hear this here thing, and it's different other organizations had goon squads. So I don't want to go too deep into it, but it was different other organizations who had goon squads, all right?
Well,
so I just wanted to say that.
But that was the first thing that my mind went to when I saw dragoons. I thought about You're right. I thought about goons that most of the Italians say, but now you're bringing in the goon squad. So, Bakari, what is the goon squad? Is it a military force that's described?
Yeah, no, I've in terms of that terminology, I've never. I think that's an interesting point our brother Asim brings up, but I've never actually heard, in my experience, of any military units that were referred to just the a term goon squad, or perhaps. No,
they're not going to say that. They're going to say dragoon. But other people, we're saying, it must be a mockery of the dragoon, and it probably is more in a private, association, and they say we're going to call a goon squad on you. Which must be their I'm tracking with you. What I was referring to was, like
the military,
like a funny word, like an abstraction, like a term, like a slang term that, what I'm trying to say is that I've never heard of that applied even in a connotative way or a derogatory way. The thing that I've heard with goons is as Brother Asim mentioned. However, what I can tell you is that one of the units that I was in when I was in the military was the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, and that what's very interesting about these regiments and about these various different units is that they have a history. And all of them have a history with so-called European nations. So there's an old history where many, if I were to, simplify, and I am jumping tracks here just a little bit, but just to add a broader a base in terms of these units, what I found is that most of the Aboriginals or descendants of Aboriginals or descendants of Moors who are in the military aren't aware of the fact that many of the units that they are a member of has a history in fighting wars against their foremothers and forefathers. And so now, having said that, one of the units that I was a member of was the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment. Has a particular insignia, and many of these units have like a short phrase or a motto, M-O-T-T-O. As an example, one of the units that I was in, their unit motto was "Toujours prêt," which is French for "always ready." And so the insignia or the or insignia for the unit was a fleur de lis, which is the badge that commemorates the regiment's service in France during World War I. Okay, now remember, this is the U.S. Army, right? And so then it has a palmetto leaf, which symbolizes the campaign against the so-called Seminole Indians, right? And then the 8-pointed shield represents the original badge of a dragoon as does the color. Now, when you obviously you guys already went over the interesting, very interesting term dragoon and its application, towards military personnel that were mounted infantry and medium cavalry, etc. And so when I also did that history, I also found that the French dragoons were involved in many different skirmishes and so on. So who knows where the actual term really comes from? I don't really have that information, but it just goes to show you that when you sit down and you start studying these issues,
I found that
in terms of like causes. I'm sorry.
I found where dragoons come from. I did see where it is. It's in what you even sent me. Oh, maybe it isn't. The dragoons came from a type of firearm that they called the dragon, and these dragoons were on horses all the time, but they would come off of their horses and fight on foot. But the ammunition they had, the type of gun or whatever they call it, firearm, whatever, it was called the dragon, and that's where they got the name dragoon.
Ah, I see.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
wow.
Now, in White Cargo, those dragoons were sent out, and they were considered the government. So that would have had to have been the British, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Trying to control the crowd. And those crowds of people were among Europeans who were,
that's right.
Of course, rebelling against the fact that they were slaves, because they were born as such, But in this case, they were rebelling and began to say, I wish I could find that in the book, where, when they came up on them one time, they weren't able to do anything with them because they decided that they would use firearms too, or they would stand, and I think it was like 200 of them, and stand them down. And that started their rights of, what do you call it, to defend yourself or whatever like that. So what you find is, as you said, it's almost the same as above, so below. Whatever went on over there, they brought that crap over here, and that is exactly what happened. And if I can, if there's nothing else to be mentioned here, we can go into the reading, or was there something else you wanted to add? Either one of you wanted to add before?
Oh, no, I'm ready to go into the reading.
You good? All right. So I'm going to, I guess you can mute your phone. I'm going to keep you unmuted on the board. And Bakari, I know that you may have something else that you'd like to add to the wonderful research you did. But where I found out the definition, I can't remember, but it's that same link you gave me. It's in there. I can't find it right now, but I will tell you. But it is in there as to that manner, as to how they got that name.
Already.
So, is there anything else that you want to add before we get started?
No, Mother, I yield the floor. I'm really excited about this chapter 12.
All right. So what you can do is you can mute your phone, and I'll keep you live on the board so I can easily find you. But if you both mute your phones, and at that point in time, we can go back and discuss what's being read. So as I said, this last chapter was very interesting all of it is, but it was because this right here, I'm going to go back a few paragraphs to show you now that there were slavery is slavery. It didn't matter what color or what your skin looked like, but there was slavery was with modern Europeans first, and do not ever forget that. That's what was with. As we said, they did in here. They did a ratio of like 20 or 25 to like 3,000 modern Europeans. And now this is interesting because, as I said, after they found that what had happened was Anthony Johnson, which was this is on the Virginia plantation now, because they were bringing people over here and setting up the plantation. He had a slave that was a brother. He had a slave that looked just like him, and he was a Moor. They're both Moors, right? And that's the neighbor. The neighbor, you kind of stick to the neighbor. And the neighbor wasn't like a house that's right next door. We're talking about fields of land. And the neighbor sort of harbored him for 2 years. And guess what? There was a court case. This is how this last chapter is sort of brought in. There was a court case because Johnson, who was enslaving his own, felt like, hey, you owe me he's a slave, and that's my slave, and you owe me for 2 years of the work that he was supposed to be done. So it actually went into a court matter, and the case was fought out in the early 1650s because Kefar, which is the name of the slave that was a Moor enslaved by another Moor, had fled to Anthony Johnson's Angola plantation and sought refuge with a neighboring planter. The runaway insisted that he had been held for 7 years. So you remember, this was an industry, and you would serve for 7 years as an indentured slave in some cases. Well, first it was like indentured slave, especially if you were quote unquote a Moor, or what they call after. You would it was called servitude or indentured slave. So after 7 years, he was supposed to be released or whatever. So he insisted that he had been held for 7 years beyond his indentured term. The neighbor, who was Robert Parker, believed Kesar and kept him on his own plantation. So Anthony Johnson, was determined to get his property back and went to court. The ensuing legal battle saw Robert Parker representing the runaway Kesar in court. The case dragged on. Now, hey, check this out. Let me read these lines myself. That way you have a problem in case either one of you do something else. Okay. The case. So now you said who's representing or whatever. They didn't say about no attorney, no lawyer, no nothing. Robert Parker, who was harboring or protecting, I guess, this supposed grave of Anthony Johnson because whose name was Kesar. Kesar said, look, I did 7 years, man. I ain't supposed to be a slave anymore. And I did 7 years of indentured term. Now, indentured terms, that means that you could have had a contract, consciously or whatever like that, agreement. But we also know that they did a lot of trickery and deceit with these money Europeans. Just, in fact, bringing them over here, they promised them some stuff that they didn't get. So the case ended up dragging on for 2 years, presenting the bewildering sight of a white planter. When you say white, the book says white, but it's modern European, fighting a black planter to save a black servant from perpetual slavery. Now, this is an important part right here because as I go on here, you'll see where that turn took and where the separation and the division and the reason why eventually modern Europeans, that people call white people, came up with their white, white society terms, marriage license, and the whole bit. Here's why. So at one juncture, Johnson. Well, let me just preface this with this. So at one juncture, Johnson was persuaded by his son to free Kesar, but then Johnson reneged on the settlement. I guess he just his ego got to him. It's like, no. He reneged on the settlement. In the end, he did win because the Northampton County Court ruled that Kesar had indeed been a slave all along, really, and instructed that he be returned immediately to Johnson, who was to be compensated. Now, Johnson's going to be compensated for the 2 years that Kesar had been free. So Robert Parker was ordered to pay him. The neighbor who was, helping, protecting him, he was ordered to pay him damages for sheltering the runaway. Now, Robert Parker is a European, right? All right, so he's talking about what they call a black slave owner against a white slave owner. No, we got an issue here because, again, there were Moors. They're saying black, but, they were Moors who had slaves. And this is the case. This is it right here. So he had to pay him for those 2 years. Now, I don't know what happened to the fact that he was indentured for 7 years and the 7 years was up, but I guess they determined that he couldn't count and it wasn't really 7 years. So whatever happened, the Robert Parker did still own. Okay, so 20 years later, after all this happened, this guy Kaiser obviously died being an indentured slave of Anthony Johnson, because 20 years later, Mary Johnson, which is Anthony Johnson's widow, still owns him. All right, now by this time, lifetime black, quote-unquote, black slaves, Moors, were becoming the norm, and all the colonies had passed laws either recognizing slavery in principle or specifically legalizing it. Massachusetts led the way in 1641, followed by Connecticut and Virginia in 1661, Maryland in 1663, and New York and New Jersey in 1664. Others followed later. These laws left black Moors freed men. They were freedmen, so they were Moors. They were already free. They weren't slaves. But they left Moors who were free, like the Johnsons, still free. But here it is. Here it comes, y'all. They were no longer treated like the other planters. They could still buy, quote-unquote, black servants, but they were barred from buying, quote-unquote, white servants. 71, and then there is the divisions now. In 1671, another measure made all non-Christian servants newly shipped into Virginia slaves for life. Ooh, non-Christian meant African. 2 years later, the Colonial Assembly passed another act validating the enslavement of the quote-unquote Indian captives. Here we go. These people have been slaves forever. Modern Europeans in masses. And now here it goes. So legally, servitude and slavery had been divided, and further move underlined this. Virginia enacted legislation making black, quote-unquote, black slavery hereditary. The relevant act read as follows. Let me read this last. Just cap it up. Whereas some doubts have arisen whether children got by any Englishman upon a Negro woman shall be a slave or shall be free. Be it therefore enacted and declared by this present Grand Assembly that all children born in this country shall be held, bond or free, only according to the condition of the mother. Interesting, right? That's actually international law. So this utterly reversed the basic principle in English common law that a child's status follows that of the father, because actually that's true biology and nature's law. It only follows the mother. English common law, the child's status follows that of the father. So we need to keep note this, these things, because they still exercise that today under English law. But remember, you are in this is American law that you're dealing with for your own affairs. Although there was no abrupt surge of Africans, here they say it again, there wasn't a whole lot of them, the racial balance in the tobacco field was changing. Now imagine this, because I'm capping up so I can make it kind of, if the racial balance was changing, it's reversing from mostly all modern Europeans, and now it's getting ready to shift, all right? The division has been made. In the first quarter of the 17th century, the quote-unquote white slaves outnumbered the quote-unquote black in the Chesapeake by more than 20 to 1. Okay? By the last quarter of that century, the ratio had narrowed 3 to 1, with 2,000 quote-unquote black slaves in Virginia and 6,000 quote unquote white servants. So it's still that's a big difference. So it's starting to climb, but this is just more further proof that the original slaves were modern Europeans, and they're showing me this more right here. By the end of the century, the gap was closing fast. Estimates put the numbers landing in neighboring Maryland in 1698, 700 whites and about 450 Africans. So now we're just approaching at 50-50, right? So the shift from the time-limited servitude of Englishmen to the lifetime servitude of Africans was prompted by economics as much as racism. The Caribbean plantations were demonstrating a much larger profit than an openly enslaved workforce could produce, and the Chesapeake planters took note. More and more, black slavery appeared a better long-term investment. This was especially so when mortality rates began to fall. In the decades when half the workforce died inside 5 years, it wasn't good business to purchase men for a life term at twice the price of a time-limited white servant. we had more endurance. When mortality rates improved, that calculation changed and lifetime slaves became more worth buying. One might have expected this to be the beginning of the end for the white slave business, but there was still much money to be made out of the trade in white labor. And so with that, we go to chapter 12, and that is entitled Barbados, like ED on the end. So the earliest known reference to sugarcane is in a Hindu love charm from the ancient hymn of the RVBey. I am sweeter than honey, fuller of sweetness than licorice. Mayest thou without fail long for me alone as a bee, for a branch full of honey. I have surrounded thee with a clinging sugarcane to remove aversion, so that those shall not be averse to me. The thought of being entwined with sugarcane could have been greeted with hollow laughter by those slaving under the tropical sun, in order that sweet palates in England might have their moments of delight with the sugared cakes and tea in vogue in the 17th century. Although sugar has been associated with love through the ages, the men and women who cut and refined sugar in the Caribbean in the 17th century must have cursed the day the fibrous cane sweetheart was ever discovered. In 1493, Columbus stopped off at La Gomera in the Canary Islands and began a romantic liaison with Beatrice de Bobadilla, the island's governor. After a month, he remembered his destiny and decided to move on. He carried with him a present of sugarcane cutting, which he brought to Hispaniola. The Portuguese introduced sugarcane to Brazil. The Dutch brought it to Guyana, and the French to Martinique. Sugar was widely planted as a cash crop in Cuba, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and other smaller islands. The English brought it to Barbados, along with servants to grow it. In this chapter, we shall concentrate on the island of Barbados so as to avoid countless comparisons. Besides, Barbados rapidly became the most important economic entity in Britain's new colonies, outstripping the settlements in America in terms of economic importance. It did this by concentrating on the development of a viable civil labor force to work it. Any considerations about building a new society were cast aside. Such ideas could be left to those developing the colony 2,000 miles to the north in America. Barbados was about commerce, and the island became a vast agricultural factory with an enslaved workforce working under a tropical sun. Barbados was different in another way, too. Any hope that laborers might have a setting up their own little farm upon the expiry of their indenture was largely in vain. Economics of scale came into play, and small tenant farmers were squeezed out by large plantation owners. In Barbados, people worked for the plantation owners, or they starved, or they left. A love of good eating sucked Barbados out of obscurity. Humanity's sweet tooth owes its desire to a simple biological need. Sugar runs in our blood, darting through our veins. The human chemical plant directs glucose straight into the bloodstream, providing energy like a drug rush. After such a high, blood sugar levels inevitably dip. A lucky rule of commerce dictates that for every craving there is an equal and opposite rush to supply. Caribbean islands like Barbados were there to prevent sugar lovers going into withdrawal. Barbados took its time to reach its preeminent position. 1820, Captain John Powell took possession of the island in the name of King James and reported its existence to his employer, the wealthy London merchant Sir William Courtine, who headed a syndicate that established a little colony of 80 or so in 1627. At the beginning, the English settlement of Barbados nearly faltered due to the problem of finding a workable cash crop. Captain Powell knew the Dutch governor of Guyana, from whom he purchased cotton and tobacco, along with various edible vegetables and sugarcane. The cane was to make kill devil or rum. The early planters were optimistic that they could follow where Virginia led and form an economy based on tobacco and cotton. To help them establish such an agrarian economy, Powell brought a group of 40 Arawak tribesmen from Guyana as agricultural instructors. Arawaks were soon betrayed and enslaved. Shortly afterwards, the enterprising planters kidnapped more Arawaks to work their fields for them. They were simply among the first of many to be betrayed and debased on the island of Barbados. The English settlers and their backers also squabbled over ownership of the colony. Sir William Courtine's syndicate, which had borne the initial risk and cost, was shouldered aside by a syndicate headed by the Earl of Carlisle. Influence mattered as much then as it does today, resulting in Carlisle being granted a patent by the king and taking control. Among the more forceful planners who shortly arrived to make their fortune was James Drax, a larger-than-life figure who later told the memorist Richard Legan that he had arrived with 300 in the 1620s and planned not to leave until he could buy 10,000 estates in England. As things worked out, Drax, his brother William, and their fellow farmers had a ditch or two to cross before they would attain solid economic ground. The decision to grow tobacco was a bad move. A better quality leaf was being grown in Virginia, and so Barbados switched to cotton and indigo. Even then, the island was in competition with more established industries and with other nascent English colonies, such as St. Christopher and Montserrat. Right from the very beginning, conditions for indentured servants in Barbados were atrocious. The man appointed by the Earl of Carlisle as governor in 1629, Sir William Tufton, tried to ameliorate the lot of the servants, but the planters rebelled. In a placatory gesture, the planters were allotted an extra 10,000 acres to be shared among them. Carlisle appointed another governor in his place, one Henry Hawley, who appears to have been a bad lot. Tufton rebelled, and he and his supporters were tried for mutiny and hanged. Sir William may have been a compassionate man, but perhaps not a wise one. In the 1640s, something happened that turned the plantation of the Caribbean into a goal more important for England than even the colonies on mainland America. European sugar prices shot up. The New Barbadians saw their chance. According to some accounts, the suggestion to move into sugarcane came from Dutch Jewish traders who had been sailing the region long before the British arrived and who imported the sugar business from Guyana. Say that James Drax was the hero of the hour, not only bringing sugarcane from Brazil, but also setting up the first efficient sugar mill. In 1640, Sir Christopher changed over to the cultivation of sugarcane, and Barbados quickly followed. By 1642, sugarcane farming was up and running in Barbados. By 1644, roller mills were in use that could squeeze a piece of cane so hard it could turn 50% of its weight into liquid. The romance was wrung out of sugar. It became an industrial commodity. Both the crop and the technology were now in place for a revolution that would make men rich at a speed impossible in England. These high-octane runs became available that in a few years in Connecticut, a general court order allowed the confiscation of whatsoever Barbados liquors commonly called rum, kill devil, or the like. One other ingredient was necessary for success, a large, cheap workforce, sugar farming being even more labor-intensive than the cultivation of tobacco. In 1630, there were only some 1,800 people in Barbados. This was soon to change rapidly. In 1634, the total number of servant ships from Britain was 790 males and 46 females, of whom 246 years old. The first cargo of English convicts arrived in 1642 to work on the new sugar crop. Barbados was on its way to becoming a penal colony in all but name. The transportation of convicts has been described as a deferred death sentence. Prior to the restoration of the monarchy in the 1660s, even more people from the British Isles arrived in the West Indies than in America. Perhaps 3/4 of the total who immigrated. Of these, half were Irish. In the period leading up to the American Revolution, half of all Scots, English, and Irish crossing the Atlantic went to the West Indies. As in America, the servants were slaves in all but name and were treated as chattel. On 12 June 1640, estate agents valued the estate of one George Buckley. They noted livestock worth 42,000 pounds, weight of cotton, household stuffs worth 1,125 pounds of cotton, and 9 servants worth 3,120 pounds of cotton. Barbadian servants could be sold to pay a debt or inherited upon death of a planter. Fortunes were made. The enterprising James Drax became the richest planter on the island. He was one of those who had benefited from the share out of the 10,000 acres after the fall of Sir William Tufton. Drax's monument stands today, a large gray block of a house built in the 1650s. From the exterior, Drax Hall is no tropical pleasure dome designed to titillate and delight the viewer. It was built as a solid, fortified house of power. The unyielding shape of his home said something about his own. Drax had influential friends in England and the organizational ability to make a success of his new enterprise. He established an estate that became the envy of all. Architectural might not have been Drax's forte. Ooh, he certainly knew how to entertain. The following is an example of the sumptuous fare on offer at one of his regalias. Excuse me. For the first course, the theme was beef, the most expensive item on the tropical island menu. Drax served rump, boiled cheeks, baked, chine roasted, breast likewise roasted, tongue and tripe minced and baked in pie seasoned with cedar, spice, and currant varieties of beef. He did this. Wow. The plates were cleared away. After the glory of the spear, more humble beasts had an opportunity to show their worth. Scott's collop, which is a scallopy of pork, a fricassee of pork, a dish of boiled chicken, shoulder of young goat dressed in thyme, a kid with a pudding in its belly, suckling pig, and on and on. Finally, there were custards and creams, preserves of fruit, cheesecakes, puffs, and more. To drink, there was the ubiquitous Killed Devil plus brandy, claret wine, white wine, and Rhenish wine, sherry, canary red sap, spirits from England, and with all this, you shall find as cheerful a look and as hearty a welcome as any man gives his best friend, reported a satisfied guest. While the planters feasted out on the island farms, the African fleas settled down to sleep on a plank in a dormitory, having feasted royally on a portion of his weekly allowance of a bunch of plantains. In his hovel, the European bond slave dined on potatoes and Indian corn and perhaps some beans. No fine wine to sluice down this meal, though a spirit distilled from sugar was used as a medicine to revive those who developed a fever, a recurring hazard on the island. We don't know how Drax treated his European and African workers. Perhaps he was better than some or worse. Some indentured slaves were treated kindly. In 1657, a planter bequeathed to his servant, Desmond O'Doyle, my best suit of clothes and my best hat, plus 6 months off if he proved a dutiful servant to the departed one's wife. However, plantation workers were generally dealt with in a more perfunctory manner. Ireland, with its ready supply of young men with little adequate employment, became a labor exchange for the Barbados sugar industry, although Scottish youths were in even more demand. The need for labor on Barbados outstripped supply from the British Isles. In 1846, the government published a memorandum to encourage the trade in servants, and in 1652, an act was passed allowing 2 or more justices to issue a warrant for vagrants and beggars to be shipped to the colony, whether to island colonies or American. Due to the political turmoil of the 17th century, many Irish and Scots were banished to Barbados for political or religious reasons. If they could only get through their 7 years or so of labor, they hoped, then albeit mock free, means work might set them free. If only for them, Barbados was a penal colony. Work might set them free, if only. But for them, Barbados was a penal colony. Those who worked their indentured years here were not part of the plan to create an empire through them. No, they were simply part of a mercantile plan to develop a capitalism on the island. Their role was purely that, to work, and through their labor, create profit in some colonies in America. The head-right system placed the bonded workforce at the center of a settlement plan. In Barbados, it made the worker a unit of production that had a monetary value. A new term entered the English language. To be transported to the West Indies was to be Barbados. For much of our analysis of the lifestyle of planters and their workforce in Barbados, we are indebted to the aforementioned Richard Lagan, who sailed from London on the Achilles on 16 June 1647. He wrote of his experiences in a true and exact history of the island of Barbados. Lagan is an engaging traveling companion who tells us he was forced to make the journey because he lost all his money in some barbarous riot and is now compelled in middle age to try his luck again. In fact, Lagan was a royalist supporter who seems to have lost his money and property in the Second English Civil War. Tuition staring him in the face, he found himself in the position of the character in the proverb for whom need makes the old wife trot, and he headed to Barbados to try his luck. Lagan's work is part traveler's tale and part manual for those who would wish to start a sugar plantation. He describes how sugar was refined and details the economics of buying and running a plantation. To buy a 500-acre estate at the beginning of the 1650s, he explained, would cost $14,000. For this outlay, one could expect an annual gross profit after operating 49. This return was estimated on good quality sugar fetching 3 pence a pound in London, and was only possible because the workforce costs were next to nothing. 30 white indentured servants and 100 Africans would run the estate free of charge after an initial fee to buy them for a set number of years. The cost of feeding the workforce was minimal, since almost all their food was grown on the estate. Lagan carefully took note of the smallest details as follows. The servants built their own shacks, and as for their clothes, these are as rudimentary as decency and the climate will allow. The male servants receive shirts at 4 shillings each and drawers at 3 shillings. Their caps, if provided, cost 4 shillings, and shoes, if they were given any, 3. The women are given petticoats at 5 shillings a piece and smocks at 4. If they served in the farmer's house, the women were provided with a waistcoat and a nice cap. The African workforce was even more simply provided for, with drawers for the men and petticoats for the women. Their upkeep was subsidized by their children, who were sold from planter to planter, like hogs. Lagan estimated the total cost of the workforce per year was $1,349, leaving a net profit of $7,500. Of course, there were risks. Lagan points out that health was an issue. Sicknesses are there, more grievous, and mortality greater by far than in England. And these diseases, many times contagious. As English mercenary soldier passing through Barbados in the 17th century wrote the following. This is the dunghill where our England doth cast forth its rubbish. Rogues and whores and such like people are those that are generally brought here. A rogue in England will hardly make a cheater here. A whore, if handsome, makes a wife for some rich planter. So those who first made a go of the frontier life must have been made of stern and determined stuff to withstand the rigors of climate and the unknown. When the small holdings of the pioneers gave way to the large sugar plantations, life for the few became agreeable, and the rough and tough men without capital drifted to other colonies such as Virginia or Rhode Island in search of a living and a dream. For those with capital and a hunger to make quick money, Barbados became the Mecca of the West, as written as follows. A man that will settle here must look to procure service, which if you could get out of England for 6 or 9 years' time, only paying their passages, or at the most, but some small above it, it would do very well. And so it would. By doing our own sums, we can cast new light on just how well the indentured labor system benefited the sugar manufacturers. From this notional labor force and total annual profit, we can work out that Lagon's laborers contributed $57.69 of annual profit each to the planter. From this, we can extrapolate that thanks to the low one-off cost of buying a labor, a planter would expect a profit of around $230 over 4 years or $288 over 5 years. All this profit could be gained because of the servant's want of $6 or so for a ticket. By Lagon's figures, the servant earned that for his master in 38 days. If we consider the price the planter might have paid for a servant to err very much on the high side, say $20, we can work out that a servant would earn that for his master in 126 days. And remember, overheads were low. A servant's clothing cost only a few shillings. They built their own hut, and their simple food was grown on the estate. How different it all could have been if the plantation owner had paid a wage to his workers. If so, it might have been at the typical 17th century English farm laborer's rate of 10 pence to a shilling a day, or about $15 a year. This would mean that over a 4 or 5 year period of indenture, total wages would amount to no more than 60 to 75. Wow. That's serious. In such a case, the 4-year profit margin from the laborer's work would drop from $230 to $170, and over a 5-year period from $288 to $218. From these figures, we can see that the economy of the sugar industry on Barbados in the mid-1600s did not rely upon the indentured servant system it used it to create a class of slave laborers whose efforts boosted profit rather than merely making the colonial enterprise possible. Let us consider if there might have been another way in which the migration of the impoverished masses might have been managed. What if the penniless migrant had been advanced credit with which to buy his or her own ticket? This is not such a fanciful idea for its time as might at first appear. For in the 18th century, a form of credit system did evolve. Equitable form of credit had been available. It is reasonable to suppose that a laborer might have been able to pay off the price of an Atlantic voyage sooner than the period of indenture then operating. On a wage of $15 or so per annum, a thrifty laborer could perhaps have paid back the lender over time. For a skilled man, such as a carpenter, in 1642 earning up to $25 or even more, the task would have been proportionately easier. Given the levels of the profit made from the exertion of each laborer, it is perhaps almost worth considering whether or not a notional level of pay for an agricultural labor in Barbados might not have been considerably higher than the current rate in England. The servant was made to work for anything from 4 to 7 years or even more. The fact is that the indentured laborer market was a crude racket, and the servants were coerced and conned into unnecessarily lengthy periods of slavery, just as in Maryland or Virginia. The indentured servant did not simply sell his or her labor for a period of time to pay off the cost of a sea crossing. The circumstances they encountered in the labor market forced them into giving a substantial period of their productive life to another for free. In his groundbreaking book on slavery, Eric Williams pointed to the many differing types of servitude and bondage, being careful to make distinctions between them and what he saw as the true slavery suffered by Africans, a life term that was inherited by their children. While this was definitely the worst situation of all, it was worse by degree. It has been argued that since the indentured servant was not born a slave, this was sufficient to differentiate him from one. I know that that's telling you that Africans were not born slaves. So right there. Excuse me. The length to which some previous writers on this subject have gone to separate out servitude from slavery seems to us to miss the point that there were and are different types of slavery. In Barbados, the illegitimate children of servants were forced to work for nothing but their food until they were 21. Other methods were used in the attempt to keep servants for longer than the period of their indenture, including adding years on for infractions of the endless rules that govern their lives. Many of these rules can be seen as being deliberately irksome, so that servants were likely to break them at some point. At the conclusion of a servant's indentured term, his master was usually obliged to give freedom due compromising a sum of money, some implement and clothing, a piece of ring, or even some configuration of all three. In practice, this hardly happened. By the 1640s, the plantation owners had taken over most of the good land on the island. It became difficult for newly freed servants to set up a farm. The former servant would find that he or she had to work for a plantation owner for a subsistent wage. In this way, the labor force was effectively kept in thrall to the plantation owners for life. In 1676, the island's governor wrote, "As for the lands in Barbados, I am confident there is not one foot that is not employed down to the very seaside." Lagan describes the position of each person in the social strata of Barbados as follows. The island is divided into three sorts of men. These are masters, servants, and slaves. The slaves and their posterity, being subject to their masters forever, are kept and preserved with greater care than the servants, who are theirs, but according to the law of the island. So that for the time the servants have the worst lives, for they are put to very hard labor, ill lodging, and their diet very slight. So this is a crucial first-hand account, for Lagan observed that the white Europeans were being treated differently from the Africans. They were being dealt with more harshly. The African's lot was a terrible one, for to be wrenched from homeland to toil for another without the comfort of even a family life is as dreadful a fate as could be imagined. However, for a period of time, it appears that the European was more likely to die an early death in the field than the African. The climate of Barbados made it particularly unsuitable for unremitting hard manual labor. Lagan tells us that indentured servants were brought on board the ship that brought them and taken straight to the plantation, where they were immediately ordered to make their own cabins. After that, they were put to work in the fields without any time to acclimatize. As follows the description in regards to this, it says, "If they be not strong men, This ill lodging will put them into a sickness. If they complain, they are beaten by the overseer. If they resist, their time is double. I have seen an overseer beat a servant with the cane about the head until the blood has followed for a fault that was not worth the speaking of. And yet he must have patience or worse will follow. Truly, I have seen such cruelties there done to servants as I did not think one Christian would have done to another. Let me highlight that as we turn the page. The plantation owners range from the merciful to the cruel. But if the masters be cruel, the servants have very wearisome and miserable lives, noted Laverne. Food was very basic, potatoes for dinner, and lablali, which is a kind of gruel or porridge, or banavis, beans or potatoes for lunch. Very occasionally there might be meat, and that only if a steer had died. It could get cold at night, with no bedclothes to keep the chill from a servant's hammock, and having to sleep in the shirts and drawers in which they work. Ooh, a cold taken there is harder to be recovered than in England, by how much the body is enfeebled by the great toil and the sun's heat. This, then, was the island home to many thousands of displaced English. Long lines of laborers would clear the tropical forest, then plant the cane. Harvesting was particularly back-breaking work, for the best part of the cane was near the root, and so the plant had to be cut close to the ground. Overseers ensured regimented efficiency. It was unrelenting work in an unyielding climate. Under the tropical sun, it must have been the most terrible place in which to labor day after day with little respite and with frequent applications of the lash. For the Irish, it must have been especially unpleasant to find themselves under a regime that was designed and administered by Puritans and Cromwellians, who would have seen their Irish Catholic workers as the enemy not only of their country, but also of their religion. The reasons for cruelty, therefore, existed on three levels: identity, religion, and commerce. The treatment of white bonded slaves in the Caribbean caused concern to some of those in authority. In 1651, Barbados passed a law saying that no merchant should send a servant under 14 years of age without the written permission of a guardian or person in authority. This was ignored. A few years later, Colonel William Blaine wrote a letter to Oliver Cromwell from Jamaica saying that the planters should employ Africans. The reasoning was that the planters would have to pay for them and would have an interest in preserving their lives, which was wanting in the case of bond servants. Such observations by the colonel and others led to tens of thousands of Africans being shipped into Barbados in the middle of the century. The Civil wars in England had far-reaching effects on the teeny island of Barbados. It is estimated that between 1648 and 1655, 12,000 political prisoners arrived as a result of the conflict. Deported royalist prisoners were sold as bonded slaves. Rank was no safeguard. In 1656, two royalist officers named Rivers and Foyle wrote, "The master of the ship sold your miserable petitioners and the others for 155 pounds weight of sugar apiece, more or less, according to their working facilities." In a petition to Parliament, they described as follows: "This insupportable captivity, grinding at the mills, attending or digging in this scorching island, having nothing to feed on but potato root, being bought and sold from one planet to another, or attached as horses and beasts for the debt of their masters." So in 1659, an impassioned debate erupted in Parliament over the plight of rivers and foils. Sir Arthur Haslerigg, one of the 5 MPs, whose attempted arrest by Charles I had hastened the onset of the English Civil War, confessed that when he heard the petition read out, he had almost wept. Our ancestors left us free men. If we have fought our sons into slavery, we are of all men most miserable. Despite such sentiments, Rivers and Foyle received no redress from the royalist prisoners. Wealthy royalist refugees also turned up on the island. They saw it as a bolt hole in which to escape the revolution being forced along by Cromwell and the parliamentarians. This tipped the political scales in Barbados significantly towards the crown. However, the pragmatism shown by the merchants and planters enabled them to continue their trade without significant political strife. This happy state of affairs could not last. When Charles I's island declared itself for Charles II, Parliament was quick to respond. All trade with the island was suspended. Likewise, all trade between Barbados or any other English colony or Dutch ship was forbidden. By this manner, England got a strange hold on Atlantic trade and held the teeming, rebellious Isle of Barbados to book. A military force to ensure that the island toed the line. After some skirmishes, the island continued to hold out against the forces of the Commonwealth. Sir George Askew, who commanded the parliamentary forces, wisely decided that the policy of divide and rule was the way forward. It worked. After several prominent Barbados citizens and their troops went over to the Cromwellian side, the game was up for the mouth that roared. In January 1662, Barbados surrendered. The planters of Barbados had one important piece of work still to do, so that their labor system would run smoothly and without hindrance. They required a code to set down the exact nature of the relationship between the master and the servant. The assembly set about its essential task, saying it was much feared that some persons within this island have exercised violence and great oppression to and upon their servants, through which some of them have been murdered and destroyed. This last statement was no doubt true, for as in Virginia, there were tales of servants buried in shallow graves. The act for the ordaining of rights between masters and servants came into being in 1661. As with so many drear documents throughout history, it had pretensions to be something other than what it was. Yet it was an ordinance of such stringency that one might be forgiven in not understanding that those to whom it applied already existed in conditions of forced labor. Article 1 of the new Act began well by banning the importation of children, but only if Irish and Scots children could still be imported. Article 2 laid down that for those under 18 years of age, indentures should not exceed 7 years. For those over that age, 5 years. Article 3 logically stipulated that servants could not trade, for how could a chattel run a business? After these reasonable conditions, the Act laid down some sanctions, taking its cue from Virginia and Maryland. In some respects, the new laws were harsher than those in America. In others, less so, but all were draconian. laying a hand on a master or mistress, 1 extra year. Stealing so much as a loaf of bread, 2 extra years. Marrying without the consent of one's master, 4 extra years. A pass system was included. Absence without consent from the plantation at any time, inside or outside work hours, 1 year for every 2 hours. Trying to escape, 3 extra years. A servant becoming a father, 3 more years. This document became the blueprint for the Slave Code of 1688 and acted to control the lives of forced laborers from Africa. This should surprise no one, for what was the 1661 Act other than a slave code in itself? By the mid-1660s, a high proportion of the working population in Barbados was Irish. Some of what we know of the population of the Irish in the Indies and their condition comes from the priests who traveled to minister to them. According to Father John Grace, 12,000 Irish lived in Barbados and surrounding islands. He also reported 600 Irish slaves in a small island off St. Christopher. An official observer, whose report is preserved in state papers, reported that in 1667, Barbados had no more than 760 proprietors and 8,000 effective men, of which a very great part Irish, derided by the Negroes as white slaves. The same observer noted that on plantations, he had seen at any one time 30 or 40 English, Scotch, and Irish at work in the parking sun without a shirt, shoes, or stockings, and Negroes at their trade in good condition. How long these so-called servants would have survived in such conditions is anyone's guess. Trading with that. There were recurring rebellions. In 1649, a major slave uprising was put down only because an African slave girl informed upon the mutineers on the island. On the island of St. Christopher, Irish deportees rebelled in 1666. The following year, the Irish on Montserrat rebelled. The English authorities hanged up to 400 rebels. In 1675, after a series of conspiracies and disturbances in Jamaica, martial law was declared. In the same year in Barbados, a major rebellion by Africans was planned across a large number of plantations. The plot was foiled, and 110 slaves were charged with conspiracy. The conspirators knew what awaited them if found guilty. 5 took their own lives before they were brought to trial. 52 slaves were executed in the most brutal fashion, 6 being burned alive and 11 beheaded. A later plot involving both Irish and African slaves in Barbados was also quashed. 20 Africans were executed, but the Irish were allowed to go free. A further conspiracy by Africans to take over the entire island was uncovered and foiled. Uprisings continued in Jamaica, other colonies, including New York, for 100 years and more. Hold on a second. This was in the just looking at the time, early 1700s, so we're bringing up today again. So, in Barbados, the landowners' perennial fear of mass rebellion by Irish and Africans combined was to lead to the exclusive use of African labor. By the middle of the 1600s, the European bonded slave laborer was beginning to play a diminishing role in West Indian agriculture. They were moved on to other tasks, becoming agricultural overseers and factory workers. African labor cost less and was generally less troublesome. In 1684, a census showed the population of Barbados consisted of 20,000 whites and 46,000 blacks. So all blacks. When slavery was abolished in 1834, there were 15,000 whites and 88,000 blacks, so-called. But European laborers continued to arrive. To this day, there are people in Barbados with Irish names known as redlegs because of their blistering skin. Not much to be remembered by for so unhappy a history. Even though the role of the European laborer both grew and began to decline within the 17th century, as we shall later recount, early in the next century, the Irish legal system was developed to ensure a continued source of almost free Irish labor for the plantation. In the meantime, increasing wealth brought consolidation of political power for a planter elite. Drax Hall and one or two other Jacobean mansions stand as monuments to the sugar industry and the beginnings of industrial capitalism. Those slaves continually resisted their bondage, and indentured servants rebelled from time to time. The control of the powerful planters remained effectively unrivaled until the 19th century. There was one final twist in the status of white and black slaves in Barbados. By the last decade of the 17th century, the Irish had become so rebellious and mistrusted by the authorities that African slaves were recruited into the very militia that had the task of putting down slave rebellion. Africans carried arms to police both other Africans and their European colleagues in servitude. It would appear that the white indentured laborer had by now outlived his usefulness in the West Indies or elsewhere, but it was not so. A well-paying ratchet is very hard to kill off. Wow. That's the end of chapter 12. And, that's a mouthful. Let me just see. You know what? The next chapter is 13, and it's short. So I'm going to go ahead and read it, and then we can have discussion because it's, we can do this and move this thing along. Wow. But please take your notes on that one right there. I know you already have, Garvey and Sam and others who are listening, because I decided this time I was going to highlight as I'm reading, and I did do so. Well, this type of studying here, this type of reading here, it really requires you to just, think about it and do a little comprehensive, comprehensive questions, at the end of each one to, I think we're going to do that. And I know, because it's so filled with information that you just didn't know. But let me just finish the start and finish the next chapter, which is called He, and this one is called The Grandees. And it starts with in Virginia, more than 2,000 miles away from Barbados. Most of the indigenous population had been cleared from the tidewater on the eastern shores of the Chesapeake. And the world of the Virginia Grandee was being constructed. In the middle decades of the 17th century, roots were laid down for an aristocracy that would dominate Virginia for 200 years. Men whose descendants would include some of America's most revered leaders were busy building their fortunes. The first Washington, the first Madison, the first leaf. These big planters were concentrated along the neck of land between the 4 rivers of the Tidewater, where tens of thousands of acres had become personal fiefdoms. Okay. Each was a self-sufficient mini colony with its own wharf, tobacco, warehouse, forge, and a village of wood frame where one man's word was law. The centerpiece of the mini colony was the big house, the planter's mansion. One of the first mansions built in 1665 still stands, known as Bacon's Castle, after a man who would shake Virginia to the core. It is a brick Jacobean manor house with all the Baroque trimming you might find in England. As the years passed, such mansions would be replaced by still grander Georgian edifices, as the planter elite consciously projected itself as a natural aristocracy. It was not just their wealth that endowed them with superior pretension. Many could claim an aristocratic lineage back in England. The typical grandee was the younger son of English gentry who arrived in the Chesapeake, a wealthy, well-connected man already. Some historians argue that their attitudes to white servants and later to black slaves reflected the English aristocracy's disdain for the servile classes. This new brand of planter arrived after 1630 and displaced the old pioneers, the ancient planters, as the driving force of the Virginian economy. In parallel with their arrival in Virginia, other ambitious men opening up the colony of Maryland on the eastern and northern shores of Chesapeake Bay. Their use of labor was ruthless. This is evident from the truly staggering increases in productivity achieved in Virginia. After 1624, output per tobacco worker more than doubled, and then it doubled again and doubled again. In the 1620s, the yield averaged 400 pounds of tobacco per worker. By the end of the century, it averaged 1,900 pounds. This does not appear to have been the result of the introduction of new technology or new equipment. In the 1660s, there were some 7,000 workers on Virginia's plantations, but only 150 plows between them. One is driven to the conclusion that workers achieve this five-fold increase in productivity due to the brutal pressure that was exerted upon them day in, day out for decades. Edmund F. Morgan refers to the principal significance of indentured servitude being that it taught planters how to use violence to compel workers to work, thus setting a precedent for the violence of African slavery. Authority was not much interested in the welfare of servants. The long-serving governor of the colony, Sir William Berkeley, was among those who regarded them as scum. Sir William, who served from 1642 to 1652 and from 1660 to 1676, was an archetypal cavalier. His varied attire, his language, and his attitudes all reflected that his ideal society was rooted in an older England, where rule was channeled through an aristocratic elite, and there was no room for notions of universal liberty. A notorious statement he made in 1671 about education laid bare the kind of man he was as follows. I thank God there are no free schools in Virginia, nor printing, and I hope we shall not have them these 100 years. For learning has brought disobedience and heresy and sex as in section, into the world. And printing has divulged them and libels against the best of government. God keep us from both. End quote. He was a planter himself with two sizable plantations. On one, excuse me, y'all, I'm going to make a note here, definitely about the press, the importance of it. I just showed you that. He was a planter himself with two sizable plantations. On one, he built a splendid mansion called Green Springs, which his wife, Lady Frances, described as the finest seat in America and the only tolerable place for a governor. Green Springs was the focal point of the Tidewater aristocracy. From here, Sir William and his lady presided over a social and political nexus in which rich planters' families intermarried, and the menfolk automatically secured the post of power in the administration and the militia. Crucially, they packed the governor's council, the topmost body in the province. Members of this council had many privileges, including exemption from taxes. Another privilege, an absurdity to our eyes, but presumably a mark of greatness then, was the right to gold braid on their clothes. The historian Theodore Allen dubbed this elite the plantocracy. Among notable figures whose family fortunes were founded in the Chesapeake during the time of Governor Berkeley, excuse me, I went to the Berkeley plantation, so I'm going to definitely make a comment about that. During the time of Governor Berkeley was General Robert E. Lee, the revered Confederate leader in the American Civil War. His ancestor, Richard Lee, was one of the early Tidewater grandees. He was among a number of the English gentry connected to Governor Berkeley who were encouraged to try their luck in the colony. The governor, it seems, brought Lee over to the colony and claimed a 50-acre head right for importing him. Later, during the English Civil War, young Lee was sent on a mission to Europe. He returned with a shipload of provisions and took the opportunity to add to the cargo 38 men and women whom he indentured to himself as servants. On arrival in the province, he claimed their head right. There's 1,900 acres, and never looked back. So he claimed their head right, 1,900 acres, and never looked back. He rose to be magistrate, burgess, member of the governor's council, colonel of militia, and secretary of state. Future generations will be told that Colonel Lee was a benefactor of the poor who gave land away. A description of him in a book written by the Lee family after his death reads as follows. He was a man of good stature, comely beside, an enterprising genius, a sound head, vigorous spirit, and generous nature. When he got to Virginia, which was at that time not much cultivated, he was so pleased with the country that he made large settlements there with the servants he had carried over. After some years, he returned to England and gave away all the land and settled at his own expense to those servants he had fixed on them, some of whose descendants are now possessed of very considerable estate in that colony. After staying some time in England, he returned again to Virginia with a fresh band of adventurers, all of whom he settled there. So judging from his will, if the colonel did give anything away, he kept a lot more. When he died, Lee left one plantation in Virginia, plus 10 English servants and 5 Negroes to his wife. A second plantation plus 10 English servants, 10 Negroes, and 3 islands in Chesapeake Bay to his eldest son. A third plantation with 10 English servants and 5 Negroes, Paradise Plantation, plus an unspecified number of servants to another son, and 2 other plantations to other children. The Lee Empire was overshadowed by that founded overshadowed by that founded by Colonel John Carter, who created the most successful dynasty on the Tidewater. Excuse me, let me read that again. The Lee Empire was overshadowed by that which was founded by Colonel John Carter, who created the most successful dynasty on the Tidewater. The Carters, too, came from the rank of England's gentry. John Carter arrived in the province in the 1630s, reportedly with considerable wealth and good connections. He acquired land on a peninsula between the Rappahannock and Tongan plantation, enthusiastically using the head-right system to expand his holdings. In one shipment, he landed 80 servants at Corritorman, and head rights increased his holdings by 4,000 acres. With money went power. Carter became a member of the governor's council and a colonel of the militia. Such men made the system their own. When one Carter servant was convicted of killing 3 hogs, a court ordered him to serve 6 extra years. When another Carter servant ran away for 22 days, the court accepted Carter's claim that he had spent more than 1,300 pounds of tobacco finding the escaper. The court slapped on an extra term of 15 months, almost 22 days for every 1 day away. His son Robert, who was born at Corritorman in 1663, would outdo everyone, earning for himself the title King Carter after accumulating 300,000 acres. Branching out into heavy industry and textiles and becoming one of the most powerful men in England's colonies. His status can be gleaned from the manner in which servants addressed him. One of his former servants, a Mary Harrison, wrote to him in what appears to be an attempt to buy her children's freedom from the planter. She must have borne the children during her service with Carter, which meant that by law the boys automatically became the planter's servants till they were 21, and any girls till they were 18. It is a begging letter that begins clumsy audacity and then becomes servile. She writes as follows: I was speaking to you concerning my 2 boys and your answer that you would consider about it. I should be glad to have an answer to it, for I want to move this fall nearer to my husband, and at that same time I should be glad to have my small children with me, if your highness pleases. Mrs. Harrison went on to ask about her big children, too. I should be glad to have them from your honor and to set your price on them what I am to pay a year, hoping your honor will not be too hard on me, as I shall have rent to pay, and then all to find in clothes, for it will always be my study to keep. So what happened to Mary Harrison and her family is not known. The Carters were not benevolent masters, however, and hung on to their servants as long as possible. One day, they would stun fellow planters by voluntarily freeing hundreds of slaves, but that was far into the future. In the 1660s, the treatment of servants in some plantations was so notoriously harsh that planters in Virginia's colonial assembly warned their fellow planters that fresh settlers would soon stop coming. As follows: the barbarous usage of some servants by cruel masters is causing so much scandal and infamy to the country in general that people who would willingly adventure themselves hither are thereof diverted, and by that means the supplies of particular men and the well-being of His Majesty's country is very much obstructed. 2 of the plantation scandals of the time, one was in Maryland and one in Virginia, illustrate what the Burgesses meant. The 2 planters involved could hardly have been more different. One was a hot-tempered illiterate, a drunkard who had somehow become a commissioner or magistrate, as well as a substantial planter. The other was a well-heeled English gentleman, cool and calculating. Both got away with murder. The site of the first murder was the Crayford Plantation on Love Island, Maryland. The owner was a militia captain called Thomas Bradnock, a successful planner since the 1650s, but a man with a violent past. The Maryland State Archive records that in his younger days, Thomas Bradnock stood accused of rebellion, sedition, rapine, theft, robbery, and other like felonious practices, and was pardoned on 3 separate occasions. Why he got off, we don't know. Bradnock was a drunkard, yet he acquired 2,000 acres of land on Love Island, was made captain of the militia, and became first a sheriff, then a commissioner. One morning in 1660, a young servant on the Crayford Plantation, Thomas Jones, was found dead, apparently beaten to death. At the subsequent inquest, servant witnesses from the plantation described the dead youth as sickly and ill and continually abused by Captain Bradnock. It seems that Jones had been hit, starved, and humiliated at Bradnock, as Bradnock tried to force more work out of him. Among other things, the servant had been forced to drink his own urine. The last beating was administered by the planter just before Jones's death. Examined today, the evidence seems overwhelming, but Bradnock was exonerated of any wrongdoing. The jury, which would have been made up mainly of landowners, decided that the stripes given to the boy before he died were not material, and he had died of a fever brought on by dropsy or scurvy. During the inquest, another of Bradnock's servants, Sarah Taylor, gave evidence against her master. Taylor had run away several times after suffering Bradnock's violence. After the inquest, Bradnock made her pay for speaking out. He beat and abused Sarah endlessly. Once more, she fled the plantation. It was difficult enough for a man to travel on land through the tidewater, let alone a woman. And Sarah didn't get far. She was given shelter in a neighboring plantation where a search party sent out by Bradnock tracked her down. They found her hiding under a bed, hauled into court by Bradnock and found guilty of desertion. She was ordered to apologize on her knees to him. The kindly neighbor who had helped her also had to apologize to Bradnock. A cycle now developed of more beatings, more futile attempts to get away, followed by more beatings. It was finally brought to a close after someone persuaded magistrates to see the girl and examine her. A panel of 3 commissioners inspected the scars left on Sarah by the beating she had suffered. Having seen the evidence, the 3 commissioners freed her and canceled her servitude. Bradnock wasn't finished. He complained that there had been a conspiracy to deprive him of his property, Sarah, and he appealed to the governor of the colony to order her to be returned. Before the appeal was heard, Bradnock died, but his wife carried on the fight to regain Sarah. Mistress Bradnock failed in this, and in the end, Sarah Taylor stayed free. However, the governor decided that the planter's widow should be compensated for the loss of the servant. He ruled that the 3 commissioners who had freed Sarah should pay the widow the going price of a woman servant with several years to serve. Shortly after the Bradnock's case, the tide of abuse cases in neighboring Virginia finally shamed the Virginia elite, and it issued its warning about the scandal and infamy. Cruel masters were causing the colony, about the scandal and infamy that cruel masters were causing the colony. The assembly followed that up by banning the private burial of servants on the grounds that on a number of occasions those burying them were thought sometimes not. It must have been about this time that the body of the white youth described in our introduction was dumped in the cellar of a house in Annapolis under a pile of household rubbish. The manner of his burial and his sorry physical condition prompted anthropologists to suggest that he was a servant who had been thrown away with the rubbish to lie undiscovered for 4 centuries. Measures were finally taken to improve the lot of servants in March 1662. The House of Burgesses ordered masters to provide all servants with competent diet, clothing, and lodging, and not to exceed the bounds of moderation in correcting them beyond the merit of their offense. More striking still, servants were reminded that they had the right to complain. However, the cruelty continued. Our second plantation scandal was one of the most notorious of the entire colonial period. The Henry Smith affair began in 1666 on the Oak Hill plantation in Accomack County, Virginia. The local Virginian historian Jill Knox Jeffries described the case as having all the evidence of a modern-day crime thriller, kidnapping, adultery, rape, and murder. Beyond the salacious details, there is no better illustration of the different ways servants could be degraded and abused. Henry Smith's origins are obscure. He appears to have been from the English gentry and to have arrived in Virginia with numerous servants in the early 1660s. Going by the experience of one skilled man whom Smith recruited, he made generous promises about allowing time off and other perks, all of which were forgotten on arrival. Smith emerged as a presence in Virginia in 1664. When aged about 30, he secured the first of a succession of head rights. Between 1665 and 1666, Smith paid for the transportation of at least 160 people, earning certificates for 8,000 acres of land in the Chesapeake. Smith owned 2 plantations, Oak Hill and Achahonic. Jill Knox Jeffrey has compiled a grim story of the nature of the regime there and how the man himself was exposed. The disclosure started in June 1668 when 2 of his Accomack County courts against him. Jean Powell complained that Smith had physically abused her. In evidence, she displayed in court the marks of bruising and lashes on her back. Then Ann Cooper, another of Smith's indentured servants, charged him with fathering her illegitimate child. It was the beginning of an avalanche of revelations. 3 months later, a child was born to another of his indentured servants, Elizabeth Carter, who was also Smith's mistress. The baby was secretly delivered at the home of one of Carter's friends, Jane Hill, without a midwife or anyone else being called. The 2 women declared it to have been stillborn and called neighbors to witness the teeny body. However, the neighbors spotted blood and bruises around the head and reported this. Carter and Hill were arrested and charged with murder. Infanticide by unmarried mothers was common enough on both sides of the Atlantic at the time, as women always bore the brunt of the ferocious laws penalizing fornication. No one had more to fear than an indentured servant in America. The mother of an illegitimate child faced a whipping and a fine to compensate her master for the time off she would spend caring for the infant. Since few servants had any money to pay fines, the mother had to compensate by serving extra time, usually 2 years. Her child became a slave before it could walk. The law initially specified that girls born to a servant would themselves become a servant and remain so until they were 24 years of age. That was later reduced to 18. And boys until 21. While these children did not face a lifetime in bondage like the offspring of black slaves, given the short life expectancy of those days, they faced almost half a lifetime as chattel. The law was no kinder to the women if her master was the father of her child. True, she would be removed from his service, but only to be placed with another master. She would still have to pay the penalty for fornication and serve the extra years if she had no money. As for the master, who might have raped her, if he was classed as a gentleman, he could not be whipped. All he faced was a fine and the loss of a servant. Elizabeth Carter was acquitted of murdering her baby, but was ordered to pay 500 pounds of tobacco or receive 20 lashes for bearing an illegitimate child. She was also ordered to receive 30 lashes for taking physics during her pregnancy. During her trial, Carter named Smith as the child's father and claimed he had lured her into his bed with promises of marriage. She said that she participated in a menage a trois with Smith and his first wife's sister. Smith denied all of Carter's charges, but was judged to have fathered the dead child and fined 500 pounds of tobacco. He was recognized as a gentleman and so was spared the whip. More of Smith's servants began to come forward, pleading for protection against him. A picture of violence and deprivation and then of rape and murder emerged. Servants wore rags on their feet and dared not ask for shoes. Their diet consisted of hominy and salt, and sometimes nothing at all. Almost all had been beaten savagely and repeatedly. Some had been kept in bondage long after the expiration of their indentured period. Others had vanished after being taken for punishment to an island owned by Smith and still known today as Smith Island. One set of rape allegations came from a former servant called Mary Jones. She claimed that when her indentured period expired, Smith refused to free her. She was held for 14 months on his island, tied neck and heel, and suffering many whippings. Smith raped her several times. As in England at this time, rape was rarely punished or even prosecuted in the Americas. The least likely rapes to be punished were those of indentured servants. Women servants were widely seen as loose and corrupt, like servants in general. This time, however, the servant was believed, and Smith was ordered to be taken into custody. Emboldened by this, other servants came forward with allegations. They included another alleged rape and 2 murders. Smith was said to have beaten 2 male servants to death. That would be John Butts, known as Old John, and Richard Webb. The record does not reveal details of Webb's death or whether the allegation led anywhere, but it does include damning evidence on the fate of Old John. He was evidently about 60 years old and exhibits all the fragilities of a body worked beyond design. According to other servants, his inability to work like a younger man made him a target for Smith's cruelty. In 1666, Old John was beaten for stealing a piece of bread. He ran away but returned to the plantation. Citing the 60-year-old as a runaway, Smith took him to the constable, Captain Bowman, for the statutory punishment for runaways, up to 30 strokes of the whip. Bowman saw bruising on Old John's arm and remarked that the man looked more in need of a nurse than a whipping. He refused to administer the punishment. And infuriated Smith took Butts home, one side of the servant's hair, to mark him as a runaway, stripped him, and began to whip him. 2 other servants watched and counted 40 or 50 lashes before the master stopped. Smith then put a plow chain around Old John's ankle and forced him to work by day and grind corn by night. He continued to thrash him. About 3 weeks after the visit to Captain Bowman, Old John died while sleeping in an open tobacco house. The local justices found that Smith had beaten Butts in contempt of justice. But because the relevant records did not survive the American Civil War, we don't know if Smith was ever tried for murder. What we do know is that despite all the evidence and all the outrage caused by the various allegations, Smith was acquitted of rape and freed. Not only that, 2 of his alleged rape victims, Mary Jones and Mary Hughes, were judged to have lied and were ordered to serve double the time on their indentures for making false accusations. The one blessing, if a relative one, was that they were sold to new masters and not returned to Harry Smith, an indication that the court knew very well that they told the truth. It has been suggested that political influence of Governor Berkeley may have led to Smith being let off the hook, for it seems that he was neither jailed nor even fined. He was able to sell his lands and move to Somerset County in Maryland. However, in Governor Berkeley's defense, he may have had other things on his mind. Virginia was edging towards rebellion, or rather, her servants were. Wow, that is the end of chapter 13. And I'm going to open up the lines if initially here to Brother Sim and to Brother Carey. Oh, my goodness. Wow. Are you there?
Oh, I am here. Oh, my goodness.
Oh.
Yo, you want to go in first, Bakari, or should I?
No. Sure. Wow.
Well, yeah,
I know,
right,
man.
right. Ooh, Lord have mercy.
Yeah,
I'm telling you.
Rosamaya, help.
Yeah.
You're going to have to help me on this one. Like, where do I start?
Well, I'm going to be honest with you. Chapter 12 was mind-blowing, but, the thing is trying to get through the chapters. And we could have just stopped at 12 because it was a long chapter, and it was, it's like each chapter is so unveiling, and then you get into the next chapter, and that's unveiling, and the whole thing is, but oh my goodness. The first chapter 12 was Barbados. Aren't you from that territory, by the way? Your family, Brother Bakari?
Yes. I'm.
Yes.
Not that particular island, but in that area, Alubai and Alubaira and Calibe, commonly referred to as Trinidad and Tobago.
Right.
So that history lesson corroborates a lot of other information that I am already aware of. Now, the island of all of those Atlantic islands, if you will, are known for having tobacco, at least today. At some point, were known for having tobacco and sugar cane. And so this reading shares or casts, the time frame, this particular time frame, in under this book under a different light, because now you have more information. Now you have a different background and a different perspective to look upon how, in fact, many Europeans or Caucasians made it to the islands, and why the islands are in the current condition that they are in today. Islam.
Yeah, and you know what? Thank you for that. But let me just say this. Also, my mind is thinking, how did it get called Trinidad and Tobago, however it's pronounced? I'm thinking that has something to do with tobacco for real. When I look at this chapter that we just read. Yeah, we'll look into that. Now, go ahead, bro. Islam, I yield.
Oh, Islam. Oh man, it's just so much to go in here. Let's go with one. Keep things in chronological order.
Okay.
Understanding what they call the mainland and the islands there, because I was writing down these dates, and as we continue to study and grow in degrees of knowledge and understanding, looking back and bringing it forward to where we at now, and studying the organic constitution and going backwards, all right, we look at the dates of those things, the Articles of Confederation, 1643 up in Connecticut and stuff, because now we're talking about what happened when we put it in perspective and look at this thing as a whole, the Europeans as a whole, and look at these dates and see what was happening in part of on the mainland as well as what was going on the islands, and the dates correlate with one another, in 1640, 1643. So, and I was wondering when you was reading this here, why wasn't the Barbados colonized the same way in which the El Morocco, Virginia was colonized, and the other parts was colonized, and it was the companies that went to those that hit those islands, all right, and so let me put this further in perspective for people, because I remember you saying something when I first met you a few years ago now, but people was always saying that when they looked in the history books, they couldn't find nothing about Moors, and you would say always look into the 16th century, and so let's collate this here. When you're talking the 16th century, you're talking from 1500 to 1599. Now, when you're talking the 17th century, you correlate that from 1600 to 1699. And this is important, people, so that you can keep, your mindset of this here, because we were talking about something on the Sons of Allah. It was dealing with when I lost my train of thought on that there.
No, you were talking about making sure people understood the time frames, as well as you were saying how you I don't know, you were saying something I told you when you met me, but I don't think you got that.
Oh, yeah, we was talking about history books, and you always say if you look in the 1500s or the 1600s, you'll see in the history books where they talk about Moors, and when they talk about Moors, all right, and I had to put that in perspective and correcting some concepts in my mind, because we always talk about 1492, the expulsion of the Moors out of Spain, all right, but in 1492, it led up to the 16th century, because what's the 8 more years you be in the 1500s and everything, and so if you would study hard enough, you would find just a tremendous amount talking about Moors, because as we got further away from that, they start trying to remove certain words and things out of the history books and things like that, so you will find it. So what I was just keeping in perspective was the 17th century. Now, what's the 17th century? 1600 to 1699, all right? And all this was going on, and then we seen in 1700, what went on in Connecticut. You remember when we did them setting up and colonizing 1643 in Connecticut? All right.
Yes.
Now, and the group of people that was doing it. Now, you didn't see when we were talking about that. They were talking about bringing any prisoners over to. They based that almost like on a religious thing, and establishing their religious freedom. The Puritans and stuff like that up there. All right, and so I'm just putting all this in perspective, and I'm gonna bring it together. All right, because what was amazing for me was this last chapter you read, when it talked about the how you say it, the the Felderdomes, FIEFDO. MS. Right, and what those were estates. They was the states or estates or domains of feudal lords.
Yes,
that's what that
European
word
style
meant.
government.
And the Aristotle. All right, because before that we was talking about these corporations that were set up. Now, when you went into there, you were talking about some type of. Now we talking about a different class of people. Now feeling comfortable enough to come over here and start governing, for say, because you hear the Aristotle and then the Plato spiral. And then you hear the what was it? The grandees, the GRANDEE. You know, the government, politics, diplomats. Now the grandees was a Spanish or Portuguese prince or nobleman of the highest rank, a man of great rank or eminence. All right, and so when you was breaking that down, because remember we was talking about they came over here, and in that chapter he clearly said they cleared the land of all the natives or the inhabitants.
Yep.
All right. Now they done did that. Now they want to bring these the nobles here. All right, and let them start setting up this government, this English government now on this land, and how they did it, because it's saying it was estates or domains of feudal lords, feudal, not a lowdown. All right, so feudal lords coming here, setting up, and then it was these grantees. They put these words in here, and we got to study all these words and look them up. Now we talking about nobles, and they were Spanish and Portuguese. All right. Now, then it was provenance. Oh, did I talk about the other one? Because I wrote down the words. Oh, plantocrafts. What was the plantocrafts?
Yeah, I saw that. Plantocrafts, where they were taking the gold, they were making their suits and, having gold put on them.
Yeah, but again, it was a ruling class formed of the plantation owners. Yeah, the leadership of government by a class. Okay, now now you starting today using these words without saying government, really. Without letting you know these were the nobles now that was coming up over here, and then when you look up, you see down these was the nobles, and they were Portuguese, Spaniards, and what was the other ones? Some of the England, and I'm rambling with this here because I'm like, Makari, where do I start this here? Because when you see England, and when they say England, we have to look at Europe there and see what they're talking about, because England is a city inside of Scotland, because it was Ireland, Scotland, Welsh. Those was the Ireland and Scotland was like the continent, like if you would say America. Now this England was like a city inside of that, and this when they came up with this English, all right, and then they start turning that into, like, you would think that was all of Europe when they be saying the English, but that was a city inside of Scotland, and it is that now. When you talk about the English and look at the English. So listen, family, get your maps out, because this dude, he put a wealth of knowledge in this thing. Get your maps out and look at the geographical locations of the Scottish and the Irish, so you can see what they're talking about and who they're talking about. look at England so that you can see where that's placed at in Scotland, and these Scots understand the 17th century and what was going on, because into 1707 or so, that whole part of Europe wasn't united. They didn't unite under what they call Britain until like 1703 or 1707 or something, when I was looking it up, where they became a real united front. And after they became a real united front, all these things with the islands and the plantations, you see they starting to bring them together and start unifying. And what I'm seeing here is how it built up to the United States of America. How just bringing in what you did for that whole year with the Constitution and everything, and following RVBey, Sister Standing on Law, the classes. This has been like like you go to school to get a degree. I don't even know what degree this your Moorish, this is your Moorish PhD, on the establishment of government, because you see if family, and if you new to this here, go back to the archives of RVBey publication and go back to 2012 and come on up, and everything that that was put it together and help correcting your consciousness so you can see this here, because this book is, the way this guy did this book is brought this thing all together. One of the things I was also thinking about is that, what was the letter? Ain't there something? The Willie Lynch letter. I was thinking about that Willie Lynch letter with what you just read of Barbados, how they cut their heads, executed, how just ruthless they were to put down the rebellion and the resurrection, that was happening there. Because in the Willie Lynch letter, the plantation owner comes to talk about, we see that you having that same rebellion here, and this is how we put it down there. How we stamped it out there. Where do you go with this here? If you just been studying and you just be looking in your mind and grabbing all the things that you learned and read from the past, and you start putting it together the way this guy is putting this here thing together, Barbados. And I shared last time too, in my family, it was some family members who amalgamated with European, and we were sitting around talking about your legacy and family tree, and the European female said she was doing her family tree, and her family was from Barbados. This here was this was some time ago. This maybe was out 7 to 8, maybe 9 years ago. And I'm saying, your family was from Barbados. Is that right? Because that's where she traced it, and she's Irish, and that's where she had traced her family back there.
That's what
and
I'm
this thing just
here.
Pulling this thing together here. When she said
that makes sense.
Now, it makes all the sense in the world, because when I brought it up, I think Annie Eda sent me a text, because at first when she had said that, my mind went to the experiment that went on, in South America,
Right.
But it
now
wasn't
that.
Now it wasn't that. It wasn't that those original people. It was these Slavics, these slaves. Now
that's right. I'm not trying to touch you, but we always run out of time on this particular show. Because it's so interesting, and we read the thing. I will say this: You're right. So now you know, and it's also showing you, you know, the Aboriginal people. We know there it was us, you know, melanated, and it's showing you how they came to the lands here in the Americas, North, South, Central, adjoining island as slaves. Okay, as slaves. All right. Now, one other thing that I wanted to just say when you were mentioning about the fiefdom and the feudal and you know, water to feed and all of that, these are all uses of the land because, and you also mentioned government. This is so important for us to understand because I recognize and I thought I accentuated all of these things they were doing with these rules and regulations and stuff like that. Remember, at the end of it, it said at the colony, okay? That was them governing the colony. Had nothing to do with the Aboriginal people. We need to be clear. And the government that you're talking about with the fees, and the load of the fees and all that, like that, right? That is called feudal law. And the definition of feudal law, which is totally opposite from inheritance, right, and ancestral states. The definition of feudal law pertains to fees and fees relating to and growing out of the feudal system or from feudal law having its origins amongst European-style government. So on the colonies, they were doing these acts and things like that. And in this book, they said, in the colony. And all of these things, they said they would say, at the colony. We need to be real clear of that because that wasn't us. We weren't a part of the colonies. So, yes, they established that government, their own, governing their own situation within the colony, you know?
That's right.
And, right. And that's called feudal law, which is a government, which is a European style of government, and it has nothing to do with us. So, and the other thing there's a few things, but one thing, of course, me being a publisher, I definitely, anything that has to do with press, and when that letter where the guy said, you know, thank God there are no free schools or printing, and I hope that there shall never be any, so that they wouldn't be divulging what's really going on. This is why, if a prophet noble draw leads to the same thing, the press is a powerful weapon. And right here, that little statement that they made, that's on page 195 about glad that there are no press, they just admitted that they, you know, what they were doing. Yeah, yes, I picked up on that. And
that's right. Keep us ignorant.
Yes, but just know, feudal laws, European-style government, they were talking about this stuff in the colonies. You know.
That's right.
Oh my gosh! And then they were also psychopaths. This last guy, Smith, he's a psychopath.
Yo.
And that's something going on today.
And it was many of them probably. He was just one that they're talking about.
Yes.
It was many of them, and they still today.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Psychopaths. Because I was listening to some of that stuff, and I'm saying they're doing that right now. You know how they say, well, we're going to make some rules that we know you're going to break. And this is why it's important for Moorish to understand that none of that stuff will apply to you. You know, they were setting you up, that trickery and deception.
Yes.
That's a loss of knowledge. So, wow, it is really very deep. But now there was one other thing, and I don't know if we're going to have too much time. We got like 5 minutes left.
Well, I wanted to say this thing about how they acquired this land, and they keep talking about this head rights. And as we, it might be new people that's on the call. What that is that for the number of servants or slaves that you had and you brought here, you was given 50 acres of land per. And so if they brought 100, you know, they was given, I think it was 50 or 100 acres per head count. And that's what that head rights and how they acquired so much of this so-called land. They were granted so much of this land. Let's use the right words.
And the person bringing them was doing that. Oh, yeah, Bakari's back on the line. He had dropped. You're back here.
Yeah.
I saw that you had dropped. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm chomping at the bit over here. I'm drooling over here because I wanted to I wanted to address a couple of issues, but in the interest of time, I just wanted to say that, well, that was an excellent, all of the information that Brother Asim just brought up was excellent, and I wanted to just throw a couple of quick things into, for people to think about, is that when you look at some of this information, how does it apply to the term civiliter mortuus? We say, I had a thought, and I was thinking about, all of these people being enslaved, no liberties, no rights, and I'm not referring to any particular nationality. I'm just talking about slavery, period, regardless of who is on the end of the whip or who is the master. I don't care if it's a Moor or not. It's not right. But when you look at the term civiliter mortuus, essentially that's a state of slavery. Civilly dead in the view of the law, yes. The condition of one who has lost his civil rights and capacities. Of course, there are human rights that are more specific to slavery. And furthermore, as it goes on, and is accounted dead in law. Some of the other things that's very particular about these individuals who go by certain nom de guerres or certain names is liberty. When you look at the various forms of liberty, it is just staggering. And due process of law, all of these things that many more speak of to today are indicative of enslavement and slavery. Due process of law, the right to know charges and all major elements, right to counsel, right to know the timeline or process of each step, right to present one's own evidence. Slaves can't do any of this. In this reading, it clearly illustrates how these people were being treated. I mean, it was just insane. Furthermore, personal liberty. That, if you talk about liberty, the right or power of locomotion, of changing situation, of moving one's person to whatsoever place one's own inclination may direct without imprisonment or restraint unless by due process of law. In short, what can be said about among the many relative and factual statements made here this evening?
At Piedmont, we know that a breast cancer diagnosis is one of the most overwhelming things you can hear. From the moment you walk in the door, we're committed to providing you with complete breast cancer care. Piedmont is the first and only healthcare system in Georgia to qualify as a certified member of MD Anderson Cancer Network, a program of MD Anderson Cancer Center, a leading cancer care provider. And with locations in Noonan, Fayette, and Henry, expert care is closer than ever. Learn more at piedmont.org/breastsouth.
The weather may be cooling down, but the savings are heating up at your local Sears Auto Center. This Labor Day, you could get 4 durable all-season die-hard tires and only pay for 3. Plus, you'll also get a $100 Sears Award card to use on future purchases. Great savings backed with a 70,000 mileage warranty. Die hard, don't wait. Visit SearsAuto.com to find a Sears near you and take advantage of this Labor Day sale. Installation required. Exclusions may apply. Offer valid now through September 9th. 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 Through September